Thanks, Chair. This is our philosophical departure point, what Amilcar Cabral said some decades ago. The people are fighting not for ideas, for the things in people's heads, but they're fighting to win material benefits. What I'm going to be talking about is a debate which has been unfolding in the trade union movement in COSATU over the last 6 to 9 months. The Central Executive Committee of COSATU discussed a paper on minimum wages, collective bargaining and social protection, in which we looked at a comprehensive review of the existing system, concluded that it wasn't working and that fundamental restructuring was needed. People who followed the COSATU Congress will have seen that there's been a lot of debate in COSATU about a national minimum wage, about overhauling the collective bargaining system, and about social protection. Well, this arose in part from this discussion that took place in our May CEC running up to the COSATU Congress, and will lead to a major conference in March next year. You know, we're talking about a wage-led growth path. And in relation to the national minimum wage, we're departing from the point of view that we have, as Patrick and others have pointed out, an extremely high level of inequality and poverty wages, and that a wage-led growth path is not possible in that context. Siraj is talking about the path of luxury consumption-led growth in South Africa, financialization and services expansion, because of the narrow base for production and consumption in the country, and that we've had growth driven by debt-driven luxury consumption rather than a redistribution, a real increase in people's incomes, which is basically the model that they pursued in Brazil. And if there's time, I'll come to that at the end of the presentation. But the path that we followed has been a path to deindustrialization. And we point out that the notion of a wage-led growth path in South Africa has to be linked to an overall process of economic restructuring, not just in South Africa, but in the region as a whole. The CEC paper that we're referring to calls for, maybe I should maximize it. Right. Basically, it says that we've failed to transform the apartheid labour market structure, and that there are growing stresses in the labour market, a crisis of collective bargaining and ultra-low wages, which forces us, as I said, to review the structures. And the proposals that we came up with, drawing on the Brazilian experience, were basically 5. Firstly, the need to adopt a national minimum wage. Secondly, that new collective bargaining strategies are required to reconfigure the wage structure based on comprehensive mandatory centralized bargaining. In other words, bargaining in all sectors of the economy, unlike the current situation, which I'll describe shortly. Thirdly, a campaign for universal income support for all adults. And fourthly, that this package needs to be linked to an overhaul of macroeconomic policies as the basis for a national development strategy. In the interim, that we require a package of rescue measures for crisis-hit industries. As I indicated earlier, we lost 1 million jobs in the year following the financial crisis. In terms of the current situation, we identify the fact that we have no coherent wage policy. If you ask anybody what is the wage policy in South Africa, it's impossible to actually to identify it. Secondly, the apartheid wage structure has not been fundamentally altered. The majority of black workers continue to live in poverty. This is true both in the most vulnerable sectors as well as in for most blue-collar workers, including in the organized sectors. The latest Stats SA figures reveal that the median income, i.e. half of South African workers earn below 3,033 Rand a month in 2011, and they constitute the extreme working poor. Given that we're talking about estimates from organizations like the Labour Research Services of a minimum living level of 4,000 Rand a month. Minimum wages and sectoral determinations, as well as many bargaining council agreements, are way below this. At the same time, we have huge and increasing inequalities between different levels of the wage structure, both within different sectors, between different sectors, and between different layers of the workforce. We often tend to concentrate in South Africa at the discrepancy between the CEOs and those at the bottom of the wage structure. But the differentiation in the wage structure goes way beyond that, within the bottom, the middle, and the top, and between different sectors. The DPRU, which is a conservative economic institute based at the University of Cape Town, did an extensive study of the sectoral determinations. Those are the determinations that cover vulnerable workers who are not covered by collective agreements. And these are the determinations which are set by the Employment Conditions Commission, or rather recommended by the Employment Conditions Commission and promulgated by the Minister of Labour. Of course, we all know the most controversial of these at the moment is the farm workers' sectoral determination, but there are a number of sectoral determinations in different sectors of the economy. And what the DPRU found was that when the sectoral determinations first began in 2001, about 2/3 of workers were living in poverty in those sectors. By 2007, the figures were more or less the same, i.e. after 6 years of these sectoral determinations, 2/3 of the workers were still living in poverty. Complete failure of the sectoral determinations to change the situation. This shows the minimum wage levels in sectoral determinations. The red figure on the right-hand side is the average minimum, which you can see is slightly over 1,500. This is also not weighted, so it might actually be lower than that. You can also see quite a large discrepancy, for example, between forestry and civil engineering at 3,000. Then this is a table on selected minimum wages in some sectors from the COSATU Congress report, and it shows the breakdown again of the details of the sectoral determinations, which I won't go into now. Again, it shows quite a wide dispersion, but also the very low levels of determinations in the different sectors. So post-94, we've had the creation of what I call a multi-tier labour market based on the structure of the apartheid two-tier labour market, cheap labour market. So adding on to the super exploitation of African workers pre-1994, we then had casualisation, labour broking, contracting out, etc., spreading on a massive scale. And as one of the other speakers pointed out, this was capital's attempt to counteract the power of labour post-1994, and particularly post the Labour Relations Act, which was seen to give organised labour a greater degree of power in the economy. So this obviously undermined the relative power of labour, of labour to capital, and went with it went together with the increase in the profit share, which we've seen, as well as the decrease in the wage share. Another thing we look at in the paper is this notion of self-regulation, which is basically that you have strong unions, strong employers getting together, a sort of corporatist model, self-regulating, negotiating agreements, based on the idea that you have strong unions in different sectors, negotiating in all sectors of the economy. That's the basic model of the Labour Relations Act. But clearly the LRA has failed in a number of respects. Firstly, was unable to deal with the situation of the massive shift in the labour market, but secondly, unable to deal with the massive power of capital, particularly in the vulnerable sectors of the economy. So workers and unions have been buffeted by these forces of neoliberalism, deregulation, labour market, restructuring, etc. Clearly needs state intervention in order to shift that power balance. So we've indicated that the struggles of workers which have taken place, and these should not be minimized because significant gains have been made in certain sectors. I'll probably get challenged for saying this, but for example, in the mining sector, massive gains were made, actually, if you look at the shift in wages over a period, and in the public sector and a number of other areas. But these are largely leading to incremental changes, not to structural changes in the apartheid labour market. The main exception which we point to has been the transformation of the public sector wage structure, although problems remain. As we've seen in Marikana and other situations, non-wage pressures and the commodification of basic services remains a huge issue for low-paid workers, but for workers in general. The lack of a safety net is a major problem for workers whose wages support the unemployed. And there's some extremely troubling statistics which show that 55% of households, I think it was in 2010 if I'm not mistaken, had no formally employed person in them. So basically you've got a tax on workers to support the unemployed, you've got a limited social grant net which only supports the children and old age pensioners, and basically the vast majority of the unemployed have no form of social protection. At the same time, collective bargaining is facing a crisis and has increasingly come under attack, for example in clothing as well as in engineering. Clothing, an example of a relatively vulnerable, although high density union sector. Engineering, an example of a relatively high density but quite well organized sector. Comrades may have seen that the Clothing Workers Union was effectively compelled to agree to a reduction in the starting wage of 30% last year after the employers had threatened to collapse centralized bargaining in the sector. So you have the emergence of what's called concession bargaining, where in order to retain the collective bargaining structures, unions are beginning to make concessions to employers. Because the question of the existence of collective bargaining structures is not a matter of right, it's a matter of power. You have to fight to maintain it. Lonman, of course, dramatized the importance of both centralized bargaining as well as the articulation between plant-level bargaining and centralized bargaining, and that's something we deal with in more detail in the paper. Internationally, we're seeing increasing intervention by states in the wage structure. We did an extensive review of ILO literature on different country experiences, and that's clearly the trend. And South Africa is falling behind in that regard. To turn to the national minimum wage, firstly, to state the obvious, the national minimum wage creates a basic wage floor below which no one can fall. It's like a social safety net. It's not a negotiated wage in the normal sense of the term. It's not negotiated at sectoral level. It doesn't relate to conditions in particular sectors. It's an economy-wide national minimum. It's to provide the platform for union struggles for a living wage, including through centralized bargaining. It's a way to prevent a race to the bottom. Interestingly enough, countries which historically haven't supported a national minimum wage, unions I mean, are now beginning to support it. For example, in countries like Germany, where you had historically very high levels of centralized bargaining, the emergence of casualization, cheap migrant labor, etc., vulnerable sectors, has meant that those forms of bargaining are no longer protecting those workers, and that's leading to a decline in labor standards throughout the economy. The ILO approach to the national minimum wage, briefly, is firstly to prefer one national minimum wage to many sectoral wages for various reasons which I won't go into now. Secondly, the level of the national minimum wage should be linked to the concept of a minimum living level. Thirdly, there should be a solidaristic approach to reducing wage gaps, i.e. your sort of Scandinavian type approach, or the approach has been taken in a number of other countries where you raise the bottom and you compress at the middle and the top. Mechanisms to determine the national minimum wage differ, but generally governments have the final say, often with some type of institution like our Employment Conditions Commissions making recommendations to the government. Although in Brazil, the government determines. There's no body. Link with social security payments. The ILO's view is that you should not link the national minimum wage to social security payments, for the simple reason that if you have a relatively high national minimum wage, and you link it, for example, to the old age pension, a Conservative government comes in, it's much more likely to push the national minimum wage down because of the fiscal implications. In Brazil, they've taken a different route, which is to link, for example, the old age pension to the national minimum wage, which is paid at the same level. The relationship to collective bargaining is seen as complementary. The situation in South Africa basically is we have no national minimum wage, as we know. The minimum wages that we do have include the existence of multiple fragmented minimum wages, as we saw in the graphs that I put up at the tables. There's no uniformity, very different for different sectors. Some sectors are not covered at all. Low levels of the minimum wages, very low levels. Lack of a poverty line or basic income floor measure. Low levels of enforcement. The DPRU study found that there's what they call a 45% violation rate, which means that 45% of employers don't even pay those low minima because our Department of Labour doesn't enforce those minima. Minimum wages have a complicated relationship to collective bargaining, and Comrade Jane Barrett here was extensively involved in negotiations, for example, in the security, cleaning and other sectors, where forms of collective bargaining were then sanctified or contained in sectoral determinations by the Minister of Labour because there wasn't sufficient union density in the sector and power by unions to compel the setting up of a collective bargaining forum. So it's a sort of a hybrid type of arrangement. Nevertheless, existing minimum wages do play an important function in certain respects. The multiple low minimum wages, for example, just to indicate the bargaining council situation is we have 47 bargaining councils, both in the private and public sector. These are the formal councils where employers and unions come together and negotiate. Then we have this 11 sectoral determinations, which, as I indicated, are not supposed to be negotiated, but in de facto are in certain sectors, and then some are negotiated at a company level, as we've seen in the recent strikes in Marikana. The 2011 average minimum for sectoral determinations was 2,118 Rand and 2,725 for bargaining councils. These figures are approximate because there's actually some problems with our statistics, but I've drawn quite heavily from the database, for example, of the Labour Research Services and others. Only the public sector, most of mining, again an interesting point, and some manufacturing pay a minimum wage of more than 4,000 Rand. There's a huge variation in minimum wages between and within sectors. No coherent wage policy, I've already indicated that. If bargaining councils cover about 2.4 million workers and sectoral determinations cover 3.5 million workers, that means that 5.9 out of 10.2 formal sector workers are covered by those determinations, which means that at least a couple of million are not covered by any minimum wage. And the reason why I'm not doing a simple arithmetical deduction is because quite a number are covered by company level agreements, which aren't covered in those figures. There's no national approach. This fragmentation, which we've described in technocratic processes in organizations such as the Employment Conditions Commission, disadvantages workers and assists powerful interests, because employers simply come, they argue profitability, they argue ability to pay, and there's no national mobilization. I was speaking to comrades from Australia, from Brazil, from various other countries where there is a national minimum wage, and every year there's a massive national mobilization around what the figure should be for the national minimum wage for that year. Whereas in South Africa, if you ask workers, even workers in a sector like cleaning workers or retail workers, what the sectoral determination says for that sector, they're unlikely to be able to give you the exact details. So many workers covered by these minimum wages are getting stuck at a level of very low minima and remain in poverty. We've indicated the DPRU study already. Minimum wages by bargaining level, this shows on the right the sector determinations. Then all wages at 3,200, all collective bargaining agreements, which is about 3,400, the bargaining councils, 2,700, and the bilateral company level agreements, 3,600, because the bargaining council agreements are supposed to provide a framework in a particular sector within which the minima take effect. The actuals are often negotiated at a company level, although the employers resist that. The average monthly wage for workers in elementary occupations, this was just to show the massive differences between the levels at, in, for example, the sectoral determinations, collective bargaining agreements. Sectoral determinations covering 1.5 million elementary occupations was about 1,400 rand. The bargaining council in the public sector was about 4,200 rand. The international benchmark for the national minimum wage, the ILO and the OECD use a ratio in calculating a benchmark for a national minimum wage of 40 to 50% of the average national wage. And this more detail is contained in the detailed paper if comrades want to look at it. And the OECD, in a report on Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, look at this and basically say that Brazil and China are way above India and South Africa in this regard, and South Africa, at less than 25%, is considerably below the OECD average. Brazil is now at over 50%. So what we did as an exercise was just to take the national average wage, which Stats South Africa estimates at about 12,000 rand a month. Now, how is it possible that we have a national average wage of 12,000, but a national median wage of 3,000? Remember, comrades, a median wage is the point at which 50% fall below and 50% fall above. So 50% of workers earn below 3,000, but the national average is 12,000. And the reason for that is the high levels of inequality and the fact that the large portion of the wage and salary package is going to the middle and the top. But if you take that 12,000, a national minimum wage, according to that calculation, should be between 4,800 to 6,000 rand. When we published our paper, the Business Day had this editorial about COSATU's suicidal wage proposal. And we actually don't propose a figure in the paper because we argue that that figure must be determined through consultation with workers themselves and will be determined by struggle in the course of struggle. A national minimum wage would be important as obviously emerges from the previous points, to combat this wage fragmentation at the bottom end and ensure a comprehensive uniform coverage. Secondly, to facilitate campaigns for a national wage floor as a weapon to fight working poverty. Thirdly, because of its simplicity, as I indicated, every worker in this country would know what the national minimum wage was and what their entitlement was under that national minimum wage. Fourthly, in laying the basis for further gains through centralized bargaining and through collective bargaining and wage struggles in general. There are three policy options for a national minimum wage. I won't go into that now. And in terms of the level of the national minimum wage, we face a major challenge as to how do you pitch the level. Again, as I said, that cannot be determined academically, but we've got to recognize that this question of minimum living levels, national minimum wage, etc., is a subject of massive contestation. For example, in the NDP, Trevor Manuel's document, they talk about, I don't know if anyone's got the document here, but I think it's like 300 and something rand per person per month. The Labour Research Services talks about over 4,000 as an absolute minimum for a family of five. And then there have been other calculations that have been made. But clearly this is not a matter of objective determination, and we argue that we need to move away from the concept of a poverty wage, or rather of a poverty level. What constitutes a poverty level below which no one should fall? Because what you then do is you create a level at which you say workers only need to consume so many calories in order to exist and to get to work. That's what they used to tell us in prison. Anyone who's been on a prison diet will tell you that they used to, if you complained about the food, they'd say, this is a scientifically determined number of calories which you need in order to be healthy and in order to survive. This is the sort of line that's been taken by Treasury and the National Development Plan. So we're saying we need to move away from the notion of a poverty level and move towards the notion of a minimum living level. So the minimum wage combined with a restructured system of centralized bargaining, which I won't have time to go into in this presentation, we argue should be consciously designed as part of the South African wage solidarity model to progressively increase real minimum wages and reduce gaps in overall wage levels. And interestingly, what was found in Brazil was that the national minimum wage simultaneously pushed up wages throughout the bottom level, the lower half of the wage structure. The median wage was also pushed up, and I'll show you a very interesting graph in relation to that at the end of my input. The national minimum wage should be required to achieve certain targets in terms of reducing wage inequality and meeting nationally set minimum living levels. I don't know if comrades are aware of a very obscure section in the Employment Equity Act, which COSATU actually had inserted in the Act. And that was a provision which requires that employers must provide information about levels of inequality between different levels of the wage structure, and that employers should in their plans indicate how they plan to reduce these disproportionate levels of income inequality. I've had some discussions with Dick about this. It's never been enforced by the Department of Labour, and part of the reason for that is that the provision has no teeth. But we argue that we need to look at beefing up the Employment Equity Act as well as other legislation. Government is talking about local procurement, is talking about a massive infrastructure development program, and other forms of state contracts, procurement, etc., tenders, and so on. That those should be made conditional on the achievement of those levels of equity and wage solidarity. That's what we argue in relation to sectoral and company plans to promote wage solidarity. The conventional economic wisdom on the trade-off between minimum wages and employment is no longer widely accepted. In the paper we quote a statement by 650 American economists who basically argue that there is no trade-off between minimum wages and employment. And the DPRU, interestingly, which I think was trying to prove that there is a negative relationship, finds in their own study that in fact there's a positive relationship. They found between 2001 and 2007, after the introduction of the sectoral determinations and wages were increased, they found that 650,000 new jobs were created in that sector. But they've issued another very detailed study on the agricultural sector, arguing the opposite, saying that hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost in the agricultural sector after the introduction of the sectoral determination. So which one is it? And what we argue is that employment performance of different sectors cannot be explained by the level of wages alone. In some sectors, sharp rises in the level of wages, precisely for the reasons that comrades have argued, in terms of creating demand, etc., will actually increase the expansion of those sectors. But so what we're saying is that sectoral strategy, industrial strategy, trade dynamics, broader economic conditions, as well as macroeconomic policy, have as important, if not a more important role to play in the employment expansion of sectors as wage policy, which therefore must be combined with those policies. So an employment policy is not the same as a wage policy. The debates around wages and centralized bargaining also, as I indicated, for example, in Western Europe, there's quite a lot of hostility to the notion of a national minimum wage. In South Africa, we were very suspicious of the notion of minimum wages because historically under apartheid, the state had used the wage boards and the wage fixing, for example, in the mining industry, not to set minimum wages as a platform to protect people or as a floor, but rather as a way of creating a monopsony, what's called a monopsony, which is to supply employers with cheap labor at agreed rates so that competition was taken out of the market. So it actually became a maximum wage in the mining industry, for example, not a minimum wage. So there was a lot of suspicion in the trade union movement about the notion of a minimum wage, and at the time that we debated it was still in the apartheid era. So that people decided in the COSATU Living Wage Conference in 1991 to rather focus on the strength of organized workers through sectoral bargaining, instead of strongly arguing for a national minimum wage. In fact, if you look at COSATU resolutions, and we trace that in the paper, there's quite a lot of ambivalence in the policies of the organization. It endorses the notion of national minimum wage, endorses the notion of sectoral bargaining, and never really resolves the tension between the two. It's only this year that the issue is being thoroughly debated. And of course, employers after 1994, for the reasons that I've outlined, because they intended to go on the offensive in the ways that we've indicated, naturally preferred this approach of self-regulation, because the last thing they wanted was a democratic state intervening decisively in the labour market to tilt the balance in favour of labour. We, for our side, continue to support this notion of self-regulation, but within the structure of mandatory centralised bargaining. So if you look at the negotiations around the LRA, the proposals from the labour movement was that it must be compulsory to set up collective bargaining in each sector of the economy. The employers resisted that, and government in the end didn't support us on that. We got a sort of hybrid or compromise model which allowed for the setting up of something which most of you have probably never heard of. But if you look in the LRA, it's there. It's called statutory councils. Everybody knows about bargaining councils, which have to be set up by agreement between employers and trade unions. Statutory councils can be triggered by any party. Trade unions can trigger a statutory council at any time, provided it's got, I think, 30% of representation. The catch is that without the agreement by employers, it cannot negotiate wages. It can only negotiate other issues. But this was seen as a stepping stone to the setting up of collective bargaining in sectors which hitherto had not had collective bargaining. This model has failed completely, amongst other reasons because employers have resisted the existing centralized bargaining fora, let alone new ones. So this combination of voluntarism and self-regulation hasn't worked. It hasn't recognized the huge power imbalance between employers and workers, as we've seen in the figures around the level of wages negotiated through the bargaining councils, but especially in the vulnerable sectors and sectors like clothing, where employers adopted strategies to undermine unions. So this is the policy debate now. In terms of the argument for a national minimum wage, this obviously has to be supported not only in the labour movement, but amongst civil society allies, ANC, and engagement with the state. And we're going to be attempting to engage the ANC in the run-up to Magong around this particular issue. Support is being mobilized in the unions, and our unions, with the exception of one or two at the Congress, strongly supported the notion of a national minimum wage, and we're going to finalize the proposal at our conference in March next year, as I indicated. As I indicated, many unions are now internationally campaigning for a national minimum wage. Historically, our fears were that a national minimum wage could undermine the militancy and organization of workers. They would say, well, the state is setting it for us, and relax. A low minimum wage could undermine higher sectoral minima, which of course can happen if unions don't mobilize, and that the economy could not cope with the national minimum wage. And we've indicated that there needs to be engagement to address these fears, but the changing realities internationally and in South Africa really have bypassed many of these arguments. So we argue for a new combination of statutory wage regulation combined with strengthened collective bargaining at sectoral and company level to address these realities. The current arrangements undermine and confuse centralized bargaining and lock workers into ultra-low wage structure. We have a de facto hybrid system, as I've indicated. The main source of resistance, of course, will come from employers, particularly in the most abusive sectors. Government needs to drive implementation, and what the ILO literature says on this is that once governments move decisively employers basically tend to fall in line. The relationship between national minimum wage and collective bargaining, essentially a complementary role. As I've indicated, the minimum wage sets a floor. Collective bargaining improves on this in the different sectors and negotiates a wide range of benefits and improvements for workers, because we must remember the national minimum wage doesn't deal with other conditions, provident funds, and a range of other questions which workers negotiate in the bargaining councils. In South Africa, the confusion of the roles of these different mechanisms has created massive problems for the trade unions, and as we've seen, have led to a sort of passivity in relation to many of the wage setting mechanisms because of their fragmentation and the fact that the workers who need those mechanisms the most are precisely like the farm workers in the vulnerable sectors where there's maybe 5% union density and do not have the power to engage effectively. So the ILO, for this reason, supports a unified minimum wage, etc. I've dealt with that, I won't go into that. So our proposal is to have one national minimum wage, complementing a system of mandatory centralized bargaining. Some of the challenges in constructing a national minimum wage is, firstly, we have no established poverty line, official poverty line or minimum living level. And this is particularly important where low-wage earners are single breadwinners in households and where adult unemployed lack income support. As I've indicated, there is no income support for most of the unemployed in South Africa. Perhaps 7% of the unemployed draw from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is a contributory system, and those who've never worked don't have access to the Unemployment Insurance Fund. In the paper, we argue for the connection and the need for the connection with comprehensive social protection, a basic income grant, an employment guarantee scheme, so that you have a reservation wage, which also compels employers to employ at that level. The poverty line is highly contested, as we've indicated. It therefore needs a massive campaign and a needs-based approach, rather than a quasi-scientific approach in determining the minimum living levels. So the point we make is that this is really a political battle. It's in essence about the allocation of surplus, about redistribution. The Treasury wants to control the process for ideological purposes. We call for this process of setting a minimum living level or poverty line to be shifted to another department, but it needs a mass campaign. We also need, what we've suggested, organizations like Naledi and other labor supporting research institutions should actually engage in a mass participatory research exercise with workers to identify what workers regard as their basic minimum needs. Farm workers and mine workers struggle, of course, have placed this issue on the agenda like never before. And as we know, the Employment Conditions Commission next week has been instructed by the Minister to re-look at the sectoral determination for the farm sector. And coincidentally, they've asked me to come and make this presentation from our side on our approach to the national minimum wage. The design and implementation of the minimum wage system, I won't go into that. Just very quickly on the Brazilian experience. What we argue is that the massive gains which have been made in redistribution in Brazil, the central pillar for that has been the national minimum wage and the increase in the national minimum wage, together with a system of social protection. And remember, I indicated that the national minimum wage is directly linked to the pension system, not to the Bolsa Familia and other grants at other levels of the system, but some of the major pensions. Just some of the results that we're talking about, between 2003 and 2008, poverty was reduced in 5 years by 20 million, from 61.4 million to 41.45 million. Between 2003 and 10, the national minimum wage increased by 81% in real terms, after inflation. 17 million formal sector jobs were created between 2002 and 2011. Between 2004 and 2008, the proportion of formal employment in the economy increased dramatically, outpacing informal jobs by 3 to 1. Is it the acceptable capitalism? Is it the good capitalism? That's another debate. But remember the quote at the beginning about people are looking for real improvements in their lives. And someone talked about confidence, the ability to go from extreme poverty to now engaging on your basic rights in society. In Brazil, they've had improved labor inspection as a key element of improving compliance. Clearly the experience is contradicted in practice, the idea that minimum wages lead to unemployment. We've had the same experience in Argentina, where the real increase in the minimum wage is way higher, actually, than Brazil. And they've had some similar gains that have been made. Unions have been bargaining up the real purchasing power of wages, as I'll show you now, no longer bargaining away the rights to maintain employment. So it's actually strengthened the bargaining power position of unions. I don't want to create the impression that there was no national minimum wage before Lula came into power. There was. But we're talking about a deliberate program of massively increasing the level of the national minimum wage. The national minimum wage accounts for 2/3, the increase accounts for 2/3 in the fall in inequality in Brazil. And the remaining gains from the social safety net. Increased incomes clearly has fueled domestic demand. It's a pity I would have to fiddle around with my memory stick now, which I don't want to do. But I've got a slide from the BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, which shows the proportion of demand created through external demand and the proportion created through domestic demand. And it's a massively compelling graph, because it just shows the overwhelming portion of the demand coming from domestic demand in the Brazilian economy, and has promoted formal employment. So this graph shows the level of the real minimum wage, and if you look from 02, January 03, there you just see the spike in the real. This is the real minimum wage. The increase of regular workers between 2002 and 2011, that's increased further. As I indicated, 17 million formal sector jobs created. The unemployment rate in Brazil come down from 12.3%, the graph's slightly wrong, which it should be 2003, 2002 on the left, down to 6.1% in 2010. Collective bargaining, this is the interesting graph that I was talking about. If you look at the green parts of the graph, those indicate wage increases which are above inflation. So if you go to the middle of the graph, which is 2002, and you see that big red part of the graph, those are all wage increases below inflation. And that gets worse in 2003, and then it suddenly comes down. And increasingly, this is at all levels of the economy, increasingly you have real wage increases above the level of inflation till it reaches 86.8% of workers in the Brazilian economy. So as I indicated, this is raising the level of income in society as a whole. And then finally, this is just to indicate that this is not a Brazilian experience alone. This indicates the experience throughout Latin America. We focus on Brazil because it's a very similar society in many respects to South Africa, but also because it's the largest economy in Latin America. But there are many other economies in Latin America that have adopted similar strategies. And when we were at the ILO in May this year, it was very interesting to see how the Latin American government systematically supported the trade unions on all the key issues, whether it was around casualization, youth unemployment, various issues that we've been discussing. And they actually were quite decisive in shifting the balance and pulling the African countries behind them. But if you look at the share of workers in Latin America who are earning below $2 a day, in 2000 it was 15.1%, and in 2011 it was 8.8%. So there is an alternative, and I think what we're arguing is that a national minimum wage, a new wage policy, combined with social protection and collective bargaining in South Africa, is a very important part of that alternative. Thank you.